All right. Well, the Trump administration is ready to dismantle the Department of Education, according to many reports now. Now, this is something he said he would do on the campaign trail in favor of sending education's decisions back to the states, which is what the Constitution actually mandates. Now, if you will, I'd like to give you a little background on the Department of Education so you can have an educated opinion if and when this does, in fact, happen. I think that one thing we can all agree on, though, right now is that U.S. education is not thriving. Here is a recent report saying American kids are getting even worse at reading. Well, in the 1960s and the 1970s, social justice reformers started basically experimenting on children in the name of social justice with their education, class justice. You can sort of surmise what I mean because we've been going through it again in the Biden administration. It was basically experimentation on children by maybe well-intended people who were also just social justice idiots. This is detailed by education historian Diane Ravitch in her 1994 book, which is an interesting read. She was previously assistant secretary and counselor to the secretary at the Department of Education. She summarizes some of these experiments that were put on children in the 1960s and 1970s, basically by hippies. For instance, some of the things they did in children in the United States. Classrooms, they banned all classrooms where any adult authority was strictly forbidden. No adult authority in classrooms. Clayton, how do you think that went?
Oh, I'm sure that was great.
There were
let the inmates run the asylum?
Exactly that. Yeah. There were classrooms where the walls were torn down. They tried to abolish testing, abolish subject expertise, let English teachers teach math teachers teach English. They allowed students to design their own courses and learn whatever and whenever they felt like it. How do you think that went? They decided to get rid of graduation requirements, grades, tests, books. Sounds a lot like what we've been through during the Biden administration, does it not? But then in 1975, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I just want to say, so when my daughter was, we were looking for, I think it was around first grade or something like that, we were looking at school options, and we went to like an unschooling place that was like that, and we kind of toured the facility, and it was absolute chaos. Like when we got done, I was like, no, I'm not putting my kid in there. It was
and you would pay for it too. And probably it was a private school that you would pay for. Yeah. Yep. Okay. Yeah. I mean, you could do that at home for free. Just let her run feral, you know? So what happened then? In 1975, the New York Times published an article showing that SAT scores had plummeted. This was the article. I know it's not great, but this is what it looked like at the time. What happened? Well, then the College Board, which sponsors the SAT, commissioned a study and suggested that maybe test scores had dropped because more racial minorities were taking it. But then they looked further, and like most racial grift studies, they found that actually wasn't true. It was a couple of reasons: erosion in learning caused by social forces such as increased television viewing, the rising divorce rate, political upheaval such as the Vietnam War. They also found that students were taking fewer basic academic courses, more, they called them fluffy electives, and they were doing less homework and were absent more than in previous decades. Guess what? That's what leads to low grades. Is that a shocker to you? You got to academically challenge yourself, go to class, and have some standards.
Imagine that.
That's what,
No, we're all about lowering standards, though. Right, to the lowest possible threshold.
So in the wake of that was born the Department of Education in 1979. Now, Ravitch said that they knew, the Department of Education has known all along, that the federal government is prohibited by law to impose curriculum on states or school district, and yet that is exactly what they still do. More on that in a moment. So fast forward a few years, and during the Reagan years, the federal government published this bombshell study called A Nation at Risk. It basically was an earthquake in a news cycle. It used really extreme language to show how our plummeting education and aptitude, making ourselves dumber, was a national security threat. Look how it starts out. If an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we may well have viewed it as an act of war. Wow. As it stands, we have allowed this to happen to ourselves. Basically, We have dumbed ourselves down so much that if a foreign power had done this, we would think, oh my God, who's doing this to us? But we did it voluntarily.
RFK Jr. made the same point last week during his committee hearing, or during his hearing, confirmation hearing, about what we have done to our national security. He says it's a national security threat, how unhealthy we are.
Yeah.
We can't even, 70% of our children wouldn't even qualify for the U.S. military. So our education and our processed food system, it's literally destroying this nation, making us less secure in the act.
Can we go back to this? I just want you to see this in its entirety, because it's so shocking that a government report would say this. It says, as it stands, we have allowed this to happen to ourselves. We've squandered the gains in student achievement made in the wake of the Sputnik challenge. Moreover, we have dismantled essential support systems which helped make those gains possible. We have, in effect, been committing an act of unthinking, unilateral educational disarmament. Well, politicians then took this political football and ran with it, and what would then happen would become an emphasis not on educational achievements, but on testing. Unfortunately, it was not a high standard of learning. We wanted those test scores, which led to teachers teaching to the test. Here's what Ravitch said. Testing, I realized with dismay, had become a central preoccupation in the schools. And was not just a measure, but an end in itself. I came to believe that accountability, as written into federal law, was not raising standards, but dumbing down the schools as states and districts strived to meet unrealistic targets. Now, she fully admits in this book that the Department of Education knows that it is not supposed to implement federal standards, but they've been working around this by funding the development of voluntary standards. Now, why is it that the Constitution does not allow for federal educational standards? Because of the 10th Amendment, which says that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. That is what the Trump administration is arguing and will inevitably argue when Democrats take them to court over dismantling the Department of Education. The Constitution does not give the federal government the power to dictate educational standards. That's where we find ourselves today. So I wanted you to have this historical background. The Department of Education does still impose radical and unconstitutional standards without question. That's why President Trump made this promise on the campaign trail about the DOE.
And one other thing I'll be doing very early in the administration is closing up the Department of Education in Washington, D.C., and sending all education and education work and needs back to the states. We want them to run the education of our children because they'll do a much better job of it. You can't do worse. We spend more money per pupil by 3 times than any other nation, and yet we're absolutely at the bottom. We're one of the worst. So you can't do worse. We're going to end education coming out of Washington, D.C. We're going to close it up, all those buildings all over the place, and you have people that in many cases hate our children. We're going to send it all back to the states. Thank you very much.
All right. So then what would happen then to education if there's no federal babysitter? Well, I think that the administration, what they want is that states impose their own standards based on their state's culture and then compete for your business to move into that state. For instance, who the heck would choose to move into New Jersey to send their kids to public schools there now that this new bill has gone into effect? This Act 1669 no longer requires teachers to pass basic literacy or math tests to get the job. The state of New Jersey considers that your college degree is sufficient, and they no longer test teachers for basic competency. So New Jersey would be free to choose these toilet level standards, and then their residents would decide if they like these politicians setting the standards thus, or if they want to vote them out and raise their standards. Other states then can compete, raise their standards in order to attract more families, and decide how they do that. So what will happen, we don't know. because we haven't tried it. What we know now is what we're doing isn't working, and we have activists implementing educational standards and they're not working. So let us know what you think of this.
Yeah, these states would then get to compete, and people would say, okay, well, we find out that, Kansas and, schools in Overland Park, Kansas are excellent. So people are going to move to Kansas, or they're going to move to Colorado, which has great schools, and they're going to get out of New Mexico, which has, lower standards, New Jersey, which has lower standards. They're going to leave Oregon, which has lower standards, and they're going to move to other states. And I think those state legislatures that'd be a big wake-up call for them. That
is one possibility. I mean, we don't know. This is conjecture because we've had the Department of Education for the most of my lifetime. So we'll see. But I don't think that, it'll be, based on what I've just told you, it will be interesting how liberals argue for it. I don't know what their argument will be. Because, again, Diane Ravitch is a liberal who I just showed you, even though she admits that the Department of Education is working around the constitutional rules and that activists have ruined education. So I don't know. We'll see.
Well, they could argue for anything, just like we saw all those Democrats arguing in favor of USAID, saying we love
regime change abroad.
We need to protect USAID. So liberals will argue in favor of big government all of the time in any socialist policies.